As we start our notes today, again, you should be adding detail to your plant poster for vascular seed plants. The front side of your poster should have general information about all plants and the non-vascular plant stuff that we did last week. There's a flipped lesson on that, and I have copies of notes if you missed that. Your 60-second writing, or just kind of your do now for getting started. What's the difference between vascular and non-vascular plants? So let's just fill out this Venn diagram here, and you can just shout out or come at answers here. What should we put on this Venn diagram for stuff? Yes. Okay, have a system of veins or tubes to move food and water. And how does that make them, I don't know, different or adapted to live in different areas? How does that help them? Yes. Yeah, say another one. Okay. Simpler, shorter, and these ones are taller. So one thing, the vascular system allows the plants to be tall because it transports the water. What else? They need to live near water. So non-vascular must live near water because they don't have a true system of roots and stems and leaves to transport the water. So they have to live near their water source. Yes? Excellent. All plants are eukaryotic. What else about all plants? They're what? Multicellular and complex. Photosynthesis. Yes. Yes. Give me an example of a plant that doesn't do photosynthesis. It still does photosynthesis. Okay. So the question, and the textbook repeatedly in two different places, in a worksheet and also in the textbook, it says nearly all plants are autotrophs. I cannot think of an example of a plant who is not an autotroph. The carnivorous plants that we talked about last week, like the Venus flytrap, the pitcher plant, and the sundew, and you can watch the brain pop on carnivorous plants or Venus flytrap, they still do photosynthesis. They're still autotrophs. They also can eat things, right? So they're heterotrophs also, but it would be more like the, the bacteria or some of the protists that can do both. But as far as I know, those are the only exceptions. But they could live without the insects. They cannot live without the sunlight. Yes? Okay, good. Vascular plants have seeds, except for what's the one non-vascular seedless plant? Ferns. Because what do the non-vascular plants have? Instead of seeds, they have spores, which are tiny and simpler. They look a lot like the spores we saw in the fungus. They're just tiny, almost dust-like, single-celled. And then obviously the seeds of plants are much bigger. Okay. Pretty good, right? So let's move on. I think that's a pretty good comparison. That's what you looked at yesterday as you read. And so we shall summarize that stuff here. And so then, again, this is from last week. This is the summary as we talk about vascular seed plants. Last week we talked about the seedless plants, the mosses and the ferns. They reproduce with spores. Those are kind of some of the oldest, simplest plants. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because we did this all last week. But here's this frame. And if you watch the flipped lesson, you can just freeze it here and get the information you need. We all good with that? Yes? Okay. Okay, so this, you guys actually just came up with this no problem as we talked about, as we filled out our Venn diagram. Vascular tissue is a system of tubes that moves food and water throughout the plant, allowing vascular plants to be tall and live far from water. So this is a nice adaptation. Most of the plants we are familiar with are vascular plants. They don't have to live right on the edge of the water. Now, there are two types of vascular tissue. There is xylem, and I made you a little pronunciation here, xylem, so like xylophone, xylem. The xylem is the vascular tissue that transports water up from the roots to the plant, xylem. And then the other vascular tissue is phloem. Phloem. The phloem is the vascular tissue that carries food. And I always remembered, because xylem and phloem, big, strange words you've never seen before. So I always remember it because phloem carries food. Phloem, food. Silly? Yes, but it helps you remember which one's which. So phloem carries food from the leaves to all of the parts of the plant. So xylem and phloem. You will need to know these. I will put them on the quiz and the test and all those annoying places like that. In terms of what the xylem and phloem look like, most of the time when we look at plants, either looking at them or looking at them under the microscope, you can see the vascular tissue, but you generally can't tell what's the xylem and what's the phloem. So this picture right here is a cross section of a stem of some sort, right? And it says, oh, look, here's the phloem and here's the xylem. And you're like, well, how would I know? Well, you wouldn't know unless the book told you. So this, and it's a little bit hard to see, but when we look at the flowers tomorrow, you can look at cross section of the stem and you'll see these little bundles. And these little bundles are carrying the food and water up and down. And when you label them, you can just say vascular tissue. Vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. And this is like the underside of a leaf. When you look at a leaf, you'll see these kind of, it's pretty clear, you can see that. And that's the vascular tissue. You don't know if it's xylem or phloem, you just know that that's what it is. This is a picture of the stomata. We'll talk about that tomorrow, but those are openings on the other underside of the leaf. Okay. I also brought my celery that we were supposed to have last week for the lab, but I didn't bring it. And I'll have this out for you guys tomorrow. You know that celery, when you eat celery, that stringy stuff that gets stuck between your teeth is the vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem. And so if I take this celery, which I will do today at the end of the school day, and I put it in some water with red food coloring, what's going to happen to it? What will turn red? The whole thing? Yeah, parts of it. And so then if you take a slice, you'll be able to see the xylem and the phloem, and actually, which parts will be dyed red, the xylem or the phloem? The xylem, because it's got the water. And then you'll be able to see it in the leaves a little bit too. But basically then when you look at the celery, if you took a cross section of it, because the celery is basically a stem, and normally just even with your bare eyes you can kind of see that, but then you'll see that the edges of that are red from the red food coloring. So you'll have that as one more thing to look at tomorrow. Now this was in yesterday's reading, but this is actually a quick review that you did in last week's lab when you did those rotating lab stations. What are the purposes of leaves and stems and roots and flowers? So there's one major purpose of leaves, two purposes of stems, and three purposes of roots. So who can tell me, shouldn't be too tough, what is the purpose of leaves? What do leaves do for the plant? Yes. Yes, they do photosynthesis. And why do we need photosynthesis? What does photosynthesis produce? Food. Yes. So some of these are easy and obvious, right? But plants are multicellular and complex. That means they have different parts that do different jobs. This was not the case in protists. It's kind of the case in fungi, but the plants obviously are much more complicated than the mushrooms. So photosynthesis, make food, and the food goes all over the plant through the phloem, of course. So stems. What are the two purposes of stems? And don't panic, this is easy. What do the stems do? Easy things. Now I'm going to call on you for a much more difficult question. What do the stems do? Yeah, they carry stuff up and down. They have all the vascular tissue. And what else do they do? Yeah, they support it. They hold it up. Okay? So the stems hold the plant up, and they're full of vascular tissue to transport materials. So they hold up the flowers so the pollinators can get it. They hold up the leaves so they can do photosynthesis. They make the tree really, really tall. Okay? Obvious, right? But it's very different than what's in the leaves, than roots. Now, roots are interesting because two of the things roots do are easy, and the other one's a little bit tricky. What do roots do? Excellent. So they absorb water and minerals from the ground. And what else do they do? They anchor it to the ground. They hold it down so it doesn't tip over. Those are the two easy ones. And what else do those tricky roots do? Yes. Yes, they store food and water for the plant. Now, throughout in first and second period, it's kind of funny because people said, oh, well, they make food for us. Well, they're not actually making the food for us. However, we do eat it, as do many animals. But the roots of things like this onion, or things like carrots or turnips or potatoes or peanuts, all of those things are part of the root that grows under the ground. And what that does is it stores food for the plant. So like this onion that sat in my vegetable basket for too long could just magically grow into a new plant when the conditions are right. Okay? Tulips, it's about that time of year where pretty soon tulips and daffodils will start growing out of the ground. Did you plant them this year? No. Where are they coming from? The ground, yes. How are they magically growing there? Yes. Yeah. So there's bulbs that look a lot like this onion. If you've ever planted daffodils or tulips, it's a little bulb like this, and it stays under the ground. It's deep enough it doesn't get frozen. And when there's enough moisture and sunlight and warmth, they grow back every year. So in the wintertime, they're dormant, and they're storing the food and the water they need to grow back the next year. And so that's one thing that some types of roots do. And of course, there's different types of roots. You saw the spider plant roots had those funny, they looked like little vegetables, those little pockets. That stores water and food, similar thing. A lot of plants, if they die off on the top, they can come back from the roots. Grass obviously does. It doesn't have big roots, but lots of little stuff stored in there. Okay, everybody got roots? And finally, flowers. Flowers. In honor of Valentine's Day, what is the true purpose of flowers? Yes, prettiness, and they smell good. But why are they pretty and smell good? Because living things want to survive. What do? They reproduce. Flowers are the reproductive organs of plants. So when you give your sweetheart a nice bouquet of flowers, you are, yes, giving them a bouquet of reproductive organs. Well, no, you're not, because most of them, right? Once the flower is there to attract the pollinators, then it pollinates and makes seeds. Okay, so if you picked it before it pollinated, maybe you know, it won't reproduce. But we do that. We also do things like grow seedless oranges. That's not very useful for the plant. Seedless grapes, seedless watermelons, right? The whole point of a fruit is to protect the seed, and we genetically engineer them not to have seeds. But anyways, so the flowers, the whole purpose of the flower is to reproduce. They produce pollen and seeds, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in one of the next slides here. Okay, everybody got the purpose of stems and roots and leaves? Yes? Okay. All right. And again, that was on last week's lab, so you should have those written down somewhere. Next. Okay, seed plants. This week we are talking specifically about seed plants, and the seed plants are broken down into two major groups, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Now don't panic, because the word sperm actually means seed. So angiosperm, gymnosperm. So then we have to figure out, what does gym mean? Gymnasium. Gym obviously means naked. I know. I believe I should look it up. The Greeks, the Romans, they like to exercise naked. So we had the gymnasiums, the big naked exercise room. Anyway, I know. Maybe we should just call it PE instead. So anyways, yeah. No, that's why you call it physical education, not gym, just in case, to be safe. No, okay, so anyways, but the reason, all right, let's go back to science. It's just better that way. Okay, so the gymnosperms, naked seeds. The reason they are called naked seeds is because they are seeds without a fruit covering it. So in a minute we'll talk about the angiosperms. There's a fruit surrounding the seed. The gymnosperms do not have a fruit. Who can tell me, what are some examples of gymnosperms? What kind of plants are gymnosperms? Anybody? Yes? Ginkgos, yes, that is the most random, strange that most of us haven't seen. But yes, we have a lot more types of gymnosperms here in Colorado. Yes, all of the evergreens and pines. Did you say pine cones? Oh, and I thought you said ginkgo. The textbook goes into a bunch of a bunch of other much more obscure types of conifers. Don't worry about those. You don't have to know those. I want you to know the major types that we see kind of in everyday life here in Colorado. So conifers, or the cone-bearing plants, like pine trees, spruce trees, fir trees, juniper, um, all of the evergreens, they grow very slowly. They live a very long time. And there's two types of cones. The female cones, and I have some pictures here for it in a minute. The female pine cones look more like this one right here, and they're kind of woody. These little parts are called scales, and the seeds are in between those. Then the male cones are much smaller, and they make the pollen. Female cones are larger, and they make the seeds. Textbook 275 has some good pictures, but let's check out these pictures also. If we look here, here's some fabulous pictures of pine cones, or evergreen cones of various types. And this is kind of the traditional pine cone here. And what happens, usually when you see the pine cones, they're already open like this. And these kind of woody scales, the seeds are actually deep in between these, deep in here. And when the pine cone is closed, I don't think I have a picture of a closed pine cone. More like this, they're protected in here. This is spruce. These ones are pine. And these ones are fir. You can tell by the type of the cone. The fir cones are a little bit softer. But so these are the female cones, and these ones are the male cones. These ones produce pollen. And then the female ones produce the seeds that then get fertilized by the pollen. So female cones, and once again, this one's the female. And these ones are the male cones. When I was a kid, I always thought these ones were just baby pine cones, right? They just look like teeny tiny undeveloped baby pine cones. But they are in fact male cones, and they don't get the same size. They produce the pollen, and around here in the spring, when all of the pine trees start to pollinate, it's that yellow dust. It'll cover everything. It'll cover like the windshields of your car, or if there's puddles, there'll be kind of a yellow scumminess on that. Or if you're riding your bike or skateboarding, you bump into the tree, this is like cloud of yellow pine pollen. So lots of pollen. It is dispersed by the wind or by gravity, and so it just goes from these cones to these cones and fertilizes the seeds. The squirrels like to eat the seeds. The squirrels will sit there and chipmunks, and they'll rip the pine cones apart and eat all the seeds. Also, or people eat the seeds sometimes too. Pinyon nuts are actually pinyon pine seeds. All right, questions about gymnosperms. So naked seeds, but it's the evergreens, and the seeds are produced in this way. We also talked in the lab, the rotating labs, a little bit about these. These talk about the leaves. These are modified leaves, right? The pine needles are the leaves. And the pine needles grow, I mean, obviously they're not big flat leaves because they're well adapted to live in a colder, drier environment. So they're pokey, so the deer and the elk don't eat them. They are thin, so they don't freeze. And if they get a whole bunch of snow on them, eventually the branch just bends and the snow falls off. You know, because we sometimes get an early snow or a late snow, and you'll get a ton of snow. And what does it do to the trees that have leaves on them? Yeah, it breaks the branches, it freezes and kills the leaves. So those trees are not very well adapted for this environment. Okay. So then we have the angiosperms, the flowering plants. And the way I remember this, well, gymnosperm is naked seed. I think I've probably created a horrible image in your mind, so you won't forget that. But angiosperm, I think, so Angie sounds like a nice girl's name. Girls, flowers, angiosperms are the flowering plants. Okay? And these are seeds that have a fruit on them. Now, the angiosperms, when you think of flowers, everyone thinks of pretty flowers like roses and tulips and things like that. But it turns out the angiosperms, the flowering plants, are everything else. It's everything that's not an evergreen. So it is not only fruits and vegetables and flowers, deciduous trees, those are trees that lose their leaves in the fall, grass, corn, everything else. We don't think of grasses as being flowering plants, but they do. When the grass goes to seed, it gets little yellow or white flowers on it. Trees like the cottonwood trees, the flowers on those trees are a little bit strange, but they're still flowers. Okay, and then the angiosperms, they grow much more quickly, generally. You grow a new plant every year, things like peas and beans and grasses and all those little flowers in your yard. The angiosperms are divided into two different groups, the monocots and the dicots. And I have another slide on this. Monocot stands for monocotyledon. I'm just going to switch to this other slide because it's got a little more information. And being scientists, of course, we like to classify everything into groups. All right, so among your words yesterday were cotyledon, which means seed leaf, a pretty annoying word really, but cotyledon means seed leaf, and so the monocot, mono is one, it's short for monocotyledon. So monocot, dicot, one seed leaf, two seed leaves. Now what that means is, remember when you were in elementary school and you planted a bean plant, you planted a bean, and it grows up, and you know as it came up and poked out and then slowly opened up, how many leaves did it have? Two, right? The two little sides, and it opens up, and it's a dicot because it had two seed leaves. But of course, unless you actually see the plant sprout, how would you know? Well, it turns out there's a much easier way. The dicots, in addition to having two seed leaves and flower parts in sets of 4 or 5, we will also have branching veins on the leaves. So roses, maple, beans, cottonwood trees, aspen trees, all of those things that have branching leaves or branching veins in the leaves like this are dicots. Monocots, things like grass and corn, the spider plant, yucca, tulips, daffodils, those all have these long, thin leaves that have parallel veins. And you guys can all imagine, you know what those look like, right? Long parallel things. And it's just a way that scientists break these into different groups. Questions about those? Okay, when we do the lab tomorrow, you will see both monocots and dicots, they are pretty easy to identify which is which, but you will need to do that. All right, the last thing we need for our flowering plants is the parts of a flower. So let's look at parts of a flower. Let's go this way. I strongly recommend you draw a picture of a flower on your poster, because you will need to know the male parts and the female parts of a flower. You'll need to identify them tomorrow. You'll see them on the quiz, you'll see them on the test, you'll see them over and over and over. If you want to practice, and I will attach some of this, maybe I'll attach some pictures to the Edmodo as well. But this is actually one from the textbook from a worksheet. Whoops. Okay. And I started labeling this one first period, and people said, how are we supposed to draw that? That's way too difficult. So I will show you. It's not that hard to draw. Let's go ahead and draw one and label the parts as we go. So first of all, we start with the petals. Okay, pretty easy. These are the petals. The petals are brightly colored to attract pollinators. Different colors actually attract different types of pollinators. Things like hummingbirds are attracted by red. Birds and bees are oftentimes attracted by yellow and white. Yes? Yeah, that's why the hummingbird feeders are red and have that kind of flower shape. Some petals also, it's kind of funny, but they'll have these pretty designs on them that, if you think about it, actually look kind of like arrows pointing to the center where the bees can get nectar, and then in the process they move the pollen from flower to flower. So those are the petals. They attract pollinators. That's their whole purpose. And the smell as well, pollinators. Then, of course, we've talked about the stem before. That's easy. And then there's these special modified leaves called sepals. And the sepal, it kind of holds up the flower, but the sepal is originally to protect the bud. And if you imagine a rose, right, a rose bud, you've got these, kind of pretty green sepals up like this, or tulips are like this before they open. Those are some of the ones you can easily imagine. And so they protect the bud before it opens. And then once it opens, they protect the bottom there. So that's the sepal. Then we get into the important part, the male and the female parts of the flower. So the female parts all together are called the pistil. Pistil with an I, not with an O. And these, unfortunately, you just kind of have to remember. The pistil is the center part of the flower, and it's kind of pear-shaped like this. Now, the pistil is divided into three parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So, ovary, that's easy to remember that it's a female part. It, in fact, has the seeds. Once they're pollinated, these become the seeds, and this becomes the fruit. So that's the ovary, which will also become the fruit which surrounds the seeds. Then the style, of course, you can remember the style is the female part because it's like this supermodel, all tall and skinny and fashionable. It's the style. It's the female part. Then the stigma is where the pollen sticks to the top and then goes down the pollen tube. So stigma, style, ovary. Those are the female parts of the plant. After it's pollinated, the flowers die and fall off, and this develops into a fruit. Okay? I know, it's confusing. And then you've got the male parts of the plant. The male parts, all together, I'll call the stamen. Has the word men in it. That helps you remember it's the male parts. The stamen is made of the anther and filament Yes, many flowers have both parts together. So the filament, just like a filament is a long, skinny thing, the filament is this thin, kind of wiry thing that holds up the anther. So the filament is this thin part. The anther is this part on top that makes the pollen. Most flowers, it's called a complete flower. Complete flowers have both the male and the female parts together in the same flower. So remember Gregor Mendel, those plants could self-pollinate. The pollen would just fall from the anther to the pistil, from the stamen to the pistil. Our fast plants, right? They'll self-pollinate if you do nothing else. But if you've got bees and birds, or with our fast plants, we use Q-tips, you can also cross-pollinate. Take the pollen from one to another. Those are all the parts of the flower. We are nearly out of time, and I think that is everything. My flower kind of slid sideways here. So this is on Edmodo. And then also, there's a few other pictures. This is the picture from the textbook. And on this Edmodo, I will also leave this blank flower, so you can label this. Plants like this, lilies, have fairly large parts and are pretty easy to see all the parts. If you do a search on the internet, you can find lots of different pictures that are labeled. The trick is, of course, that some of them have much more information than you need, but just look at those, those things. So that is everything we need. You'll see it on the quiz, and as I mentioned, tomorrow in the lab, you will get to see all of these parts.